The air in the Laurent room hummed with a specific kind of money. It wasn't loud or showy. It was the low, confident murmur of people who had never once wondered if they could afford the wine they were ordering. Crystal glasses clinked like delicate bells. Laughter was measured and smooth. The lights were soft, making the women's jewels sparkle, and the men's watches gleam with a quiet importance. She moved through it all like a ghost in a black and white uniform. Her name was Elena, but nobody here needed to know that. To the guests, she was a polite smile, a pair of careful hands presenting a tray of scallops on tiny spoons. She was the excuse me that parted a conversation. The empty glass vanished from a side table, a function, not a person. She preferred it that way. Invisibility was a kind of armor. Her tray was empty now, and she wove her way back toward the gleaming darkness of the service doors. As she passed the grand piano in the corner, her steps slowed, just for a heartbeat. The hired pianist, a man in a sharp tuxedo, was playing something by Gershwin. It was competent, pleasant, the perfect sonic wallpaper for a room like this. But Elena's ear, trained since she was 6 years old, heard the tiny stumble in the left hand during a syncopated passage, the safe. Simple chords where a more complex harmony could have lived. Her fingers, curled around the edges of her tray, flexed almost imperceptibly. Without looking down, she played the correct, richer chord progression against the stiff fabric of her skirt. The motion was so small, so ingrained, it was more a thought than an action. The kitchen doors swung shut behind her, swapping the world of low lights and murmur for one of stainless steel, shouted orders, and blistering heat. The contrast was always a shock. Martin, Table 12 needs a round of the Cabernet. Now, not tomorrow. Carl, the event manager, snapped his fingers in her direction as he rushed past, a headset clamped to his ear. His face was permanently flushed with a mild panic. "On it," she said, her voice calm. She deposited her tray, grabbed a fresh one, and loaded 4 glasses of deep red wine with a steady hand. No spills, no hesitation. She was good at this job. Efficient, reliable, invisible. It paid the rent on her tiny studio apartment, and, most importantly, it chipped away, month by agonizing month, at the mountain of medical bills that followed her like a shadow. The debt was a physical weight, a constant, low-grade hum in her chest, different from the room's murmur. It was the reason the piano in the corner felt like a planet away, even though she could see it through the round window in the kitchen door. It was the reason the calluses on her fingertips from a lifetime of practice were now joined by a smaller, newer one on her right thumb from uncorking bottles. She pushed back through the doors, the wine glasses catching the light. As she served, smiling politely at a man who spoke to his companion, without even glancing at her, she let her mind drift back. It used to be her on that bench, under a different, brighter light. The memory was so vivid, it was almost painful. The feel of the cool, ivory keys under her eager fingers, the giant resonant sound of a concert grand filling an auditorium, not a dining room. The approving nod from her professor at Juilliard after she'd mastered a particularly fiendish piece by Liszt, that life had been traded for this one. Her mother's long illness had swallowed every saving, every future plan. The piano hadn't just been a dream. It had been a luxury, and luxuries were the first thing to go. She'd sold her own beloved upright to cover a month of prescriptions. The silence in her apartment, after it was gone, was worse than any noise. "You're hovering?" Carl's voice jerked her back to the present. She was standing still by the service station, her empty tray held stiffly. "Sorry," she murmured, quickly moving to clear a clutter of used dessert plates. Carl followed her, his voice low but sharp. "I need you focused, Martin. This is the Symphony Gala. These people notice everything. They paid a fortune to be here, and the slightest slip-up reflects on me. On this venue. You understand? Yes, of course. Good. Eyes on the tables, not the entertainment. He gave a dismissive jerk of his chin toward the pianist. That thing he's playing? The piano alone is worth more than you'll make in 5 years. So let's just stick to what we know, all right? A hot spark of something anger, shame, defiance flared in her chest, but she extinguished it instantly. She just nodded. All right. For the next hour, she was a perfect machine. She anticipated empty glasses. She cleared plates with silent efficiency. She navigated the crowded room with a ballet dancer's awareness, never bumping, never spilling. And all the while, under the surface, the music played dot in her mind. She wasn't in the Laurent room. She was on a stage. The clatter of cutlery became the rustle of a program. The guests' chatter transformed into the expectant hush before a first note. And the safe, simple jazz from the corner piano was rewritten, in real time, by her own internal symphony. She added flourishes, changed keys, built crescendos in her head, where the hired player only offered a gentle wave. During a lull, she found herself stationed near the back wall, not far from the piano. The pianist was taking a break, sipping water. The bench was empty. The black lid of the grand piano was propped open, revealing the intricate golden harp of strings inside. It was a beautiful, powerful beast, sleeping. Her feet carried her 2 steps closer. It was an unconscious pull, like metal to a magnet. From here, she could see the maker's name etched in elegant script on the side, Steinway and Sons. Her heart gave a familiar, aching squeeze. She could almost smell the unique scent of aged wood, felt cloth, and slight metallic dust that lived inside every great piano. Her right hand lifted from her side. Just a little. Her fingers, resting against her thigh, began to move. Not a dramatic gesture, but the precise, measured motion of a scale, a C minor melodic scale, 3 octaves, the fingering automatic and perfect. Her thumb crossed under, her 3rd finger over, the pattern as natural as breathing. She could feel the imaginary resistance of the keys, the slight give, then the solid bottom as the hammer would strike the string. Planning on giving us a show? She froze, her hand snapping to her side. A busboy, a guy about her age with a kind smile, was stacking chairs nearby. He'd seen her. She felt a flush creep up her neck. No, it's a nice piano. Looks it, he said, not pushing. He hefted a chair. Seems a shame just to have old what's-his-name tinkling on it all night. She offered a small, tight smile, but said nothing. The moment was broken. The pianist was returning, adjusting his cuffs. The spell was over. Elena retreated to her post by the kitchen door, the ghost of the scale still tingling in her fingertips. She watched as the event's host, a formidable woman in a silver gown whom everyone called Mrs. Delaney, glided over to the pianist. She said something, and he laughed a too loud, professional laugh. Mrs. Delaney was the kind of person who owned rooms like this, who made decisions that affected other people's lives with a wave of her hand. She was a universe away from a waitress worrying about her rent. The gala was building toward its main event, a performance by a real star, a pianist from the City Symphony who was the evening's big draw. Elena felt a pang of something sharper than envy. It was a deep, hollow longing. That should have been her path. That could have been her. Carl buzzed past her again. All right, people. Intermission is in 20. The maestro is about to play his featured piece. Look sharp. Coffee service will be a nightmare. Martin, you're on the east quadrant with the silver pots. No mistakes. No mistakes, Elena repeated softly, her eyes drifting one last time to the beautiful, silent, impossible piano. For now, her stage was the carpeted floor of the Laurent room, her performance the silent, flawless service of others. The music would have to wait. It had been waiting for years. It could wait a little longer. She smoothed her apron, fixed her polite, vacant smile back in place, and prepared to disappear into the crowd once more. The low hum of the room shifted. Conversations began to pause, and chairs subtly turned toward the piano. A man, older than the previous player, with a shock of white hair and an air of comfortable importance, was making his way through the crowd. This was the maestro. Polite applause rippled through the tables as he gave a practiced, gracious nod. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Elena paused near the service station, a stack of empty dessert plates in her hands. She couldn't help but watch. This was the real thing, not just background music. The man settled himself on the bench, took a slow, visible breath to center himself, and the room fell into a deep, respectful silence. Even the clinking from the kitchen seemed to hush. His hands came down, and from the first chord, Alina knew. This was different. The sound was richer, deeper, commanding. He was playing a Rachmaninoff prelude, one of the dramatic ones, full of stormy emotion and technical fire. The notes weren't just played. They were unleashed. They rolled through the grand room like thunder, beautiful and powerful. For a moment, Alina was gone. She wasn't a waitress holding dirty plates. She was 10 years old again, hearing this piece for the first time on a scratchy recording, her heart pounding with the sheer size of it. She was 16, struggling for months to master a single page of its complicated left-hand patterns, her fingers aching, her teacher patiently urging her on. The memory was so sharp it stole her breath. She stood, transfixed, the noise of the event fading away. In her mind, her own hands mirrored the maestro's on the invisible keyboard of her apron. The jumps, the crashes of sound, the delicate, aching melody that rose above it all. She felt every note in her bones. He was building toward the climax, the part where the music becomes a crashing wave, all fury and passion. The crowd was perfectly still, caught in the spell. Alina's muscles tensed with the shared effort of it. This was it. The final, furious run down the keyboard before the resolution. Twang! The sound was wrong. It was a brutal, metallic snap, a jarring, ugly noise that cut through the beautiful music like a shout in a library. The music stopped dead. The maestro's hands froze above the keys. A single wounded note seemed to hang in the sudden, awful silence. Then nothing. His face, a moment ago lost in the passion of the piece, was now a mask of confusion and annoyance. He peered inside the piano. A whisper went through the crowd, then another. It was the sound of a spell breaking. People shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. From her spot, Elena knew instantly what had happened. A string had snapped. On a piano, especially during such a forceful piece, it wasn't unheard of. But the timing couldn't have been worse. The event's host, Mrs. Delaney, was on her feet in an instant, her silver gown flashing as she moved swiftly to the piano. Her smile was tight, worried. She spoke quietly to the maestro, who was now standing, looking down into the piano's guts with a grim expression. He shook his head and said something that made Mrs. Delaney's perfectly composed face fall for just a second. Carl, the manager, materialized from the back, his own face pale. He looked like he might be sick. This was a disaster on his watch. A man in a simple black suit, the venue's technician, hurried over with a small toolbox. He opened the piano wider, his head disappearing inside. All eyes were on him. The crowd's murmur grew louder, now tinged with disappointment. This was the headline act, and it had broken. After a minute that felt like an hour, the technician straightened up. He wiped his hands on a cloth and spoke quietly to Mrs. Delaney and Carl. Elena, from her years around instruments, could read his body language. It wasn't good. He was explaining, not fixing. Carl's shoulders slumped. The maestro was nodding, his lips a thin line. He addressed the crowd directly, his voice projecting with practiced ease, but Elena could hear the frustration underneath. "My sincerest apologies, ladies and gentlemen," he said, forcing a smile. "It seems our noble instrument has decided to protest the vigor of poor Rachmaninoff. A string has given way. While it is a simple repair for tomorrow, to continue now would risk damage to the piano." He gave a small, regretful shrug. "The music for tonight must unfortunately be cut short." A collective sigh of disappointment washed through the room. Mrs. Delaney stepped forward, her voice bright but strained. "Well, we shall have a slightly longer intermission. Please enjoy another drink on the terrace. The music will resume shortly." But her eyes, scanning the disappointed faces of her wealthy guests and the important symphony donors, screamed panic dot as the crowd began to rise. Talking loudly now about the dramatic interruption, Carl rushed over to the service staff, his headset crackling. His voice was low and frantic. "This is bad. This is really, really bad. Delaney is about to blow a gasket. The whole second half of the event was built around this." He ran a hand over his face. "Okay, think. Does anyone know a pianist? Is there a guest? Someone's +1? A cousin? A nephew? Anything?" The small group of servers and bartenders looked at each other. They were a crew of students, artists, and gig workers. One of the bartenders was a great DJ. Another server was an amazing singer in a punk band. But a classical pianist? For this crowd? They shook their heads, muttering sorry and no. Elena felt the words form in her throat. They felt like stones. Her heart was hammering so hard, she was sure everyone could see it beating through her uniform. This was the piano. Her piano. The piece that broke was one she knew by heart. She could play it in her sleep. The thought was terrifying. Ridiculous. Carl was spiraling. There's got to be someone. We can't just have silence. We'll look like complete idiots. Mrs. Delaney swept over, her composure barely holding. "Well, any miracles?" she asked Carl, her voice icy. Carl just shook his head, helpless. Elena looked at the grand piano. It stood there, lid open like a wounded bird. She looked at the disappointed, milling crowd. She saw the maestro, still looking annoyed, chatting with a donor as if to say, "What can you do?" And she saw Carl's desperate, sweating face. The memory of the music, the right music, flooded her. It wasn't about showing off. It wasn't even about her dream anymore. It was about the simple, gut-level need to fix the broken thing, to fill the silence with what was supposed to be there. The fear was immense, a cold weight in her stomach. But underneath it, a stronger, older feeling was stirring. Certainty. She knew she could do this. Her feet moved before her mind could talk her out of it. She took one step forward, then another, away from the safety of the other servers. She felt every eye in the service team on her back. Carl saw her approaching, and his face twisted in irritation. "Not now, Martin. What do you need?" She stopped in front of him, and Mrs. Delaney. Her mouth was dry. She tried to speak, but only a whisper came out. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I can play." The words hung in the air. Carl stared at her as if she'd just spoken in another language. He blinked. "What?" "I can play the piano," she said, a little louder. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "I can fill the time." A laugh burst out of Carl, a short, harsh sound of pure stress. "You're a waitress. Elena, come on. This isn't the time for jokes. Get back to your station." But Mrs. Delaney didn't laugh. She was studying Elena with fierce, searching eyes. She wasn't seeing the uniform now. She was looking at Elena's face, at her eyes, at the way she held herself. "What is your name?" Mrs. Delaney asked, her voice calm and direct. "Elena," she said. "Elena," Mrs. Delaney repeated. "You see the room. You see the guests. What would you play for them?" Elena didn't even have to think. The answer was just there. Something they know, but not the way they've heard it. Something quiet to settle them after the shock. Then something to make them forget the shock ever happened. Mrs. Delaney was silent for a long moment. The noise of the crowd seemed to grow louder around them. Carl looked like he wanted to argue, but one sharp look from Mrs. Delaney silenced him. "Can you really do this?" Mrs. Delaney asked. It wasn't a question of skill, not really. It was a question of nerve. Elena met her gaze. The fear was still there, buzzing in her veins, but it was met now by a solid, steady resolve. She thought of the years of practice, the thousands of hours, the music that lived in her hands, whether she wanted it to or not. This was why. For a moment like this, even if she hadn't known it. "Yes," Elena said. And this time, it was not a whisper. Mrs. Delaney gave a single, sharp nod. "All right," she turned to Carl. "Get her a different jacket. Something black. No logos." Then back to Elena. "You have 5 minutes before I send them back to their seats. Don't make me regret this." She turned and walked away, already putting her hostess' smile back on to manage the crowd. Elena stood there, stunned. It had happened. Carl was staring at her, his expression a wild mix of disbelief, hope, and terror. "You'd better be a freaking genius," he muttered, but he was already gesturing for her to follow him to the back office, where a spare black blazer might be found. The 5-minute clock was ticking. The weight of the silence she had to fill was now squarely on her shoulders. The world seemed to shrink down to a narrow tunnel. Elena followed Carl's stiff back through the bustling kitchen. The shouts of the cooks, the hiss of the steam, the clatter of pans, it all blurred into a distant, meaningless noise. Her own heartbeat was the loudest sound in the universe, a frantic drum against her ribs. Carl pushed open the door to a small, cluttered office. He yanked open a closet, rummaging past boxes of napkins and spare uniform parts. "It has to be here somewhere," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He pulled out a simple black women's blazer. It was a little too big, meant for a manager, but it was plain and professional. He thrust it at her. "Here, put this on. Lose the apron." Her fingers felt thick and clumsy as she untied the strings of her server's apron. The stiff white fabric, her uniform of invisibility, fell away. She shrugged on the blazer. It smelled faintly of stale coffee and dust, but it changed her shape. She was no longer dressed to serve. She looked, at least from a distance, like she belonged at one of the tables. Carl looked her up and down, his face pale. "Look, Elena, if this goes badly—" He didn't finish the sentence. The threat was clear. Her job, her already precarious livelihood, hung in the balance. But a bigger, stranger thought pushed that one aside. If this went badly, she would have failed the music. That felt worse. "It won't," she said. The words surprised her with their quiet steadiness. He just shook his head, blowing out a long, worried breath. Okay, go, through the back. Wait by the service entrance to the main room. I'll give you the signal." She nodded and slipped back out into the kitchen. The other staff had heard. They stared as she passed. The kind busboy from earlier caught her eye and gave her a quick, tight smile and a thumbs up. A dishwasher paused, a rack of glasses in his hands, his expression one of pure shock. She was one of them, and she was walking toward the lion's den. She felt like a ghost walking through her own life. She pushed open the heavy door to the service corridor and stood in the dim space beside the entrance to the Laurent room. Through the crack in the door, She could see a slice of the event. Guests were filtering back from the terrace, their faces still showing the letdown from the interrupted performance. They were settling back into their chairs with a murmur of resignation. The evening's excitement had fizzled out. Mrs. Delaney was moving to the front of the room, her smile bright and forceful. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please." While our beloved instrument had a momentary rebellion, the show, as they say, must go on. Her voice was full of a confidence Elena knew was paper thin. "We are so very fortunate to have a special surprise talent with us tonight. Please give a warm welcome to Elena." She said the name with a graceful sweep of her hand toward the service door. It was Carl's signal. This was it. Elena's breath caught. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to run back to the kitchen, to grab a tray and disappear into the familiar routine of pouring coffee. For 3 long seconds, she couldn't move. Her feet were glued to the floor. She saw the heads in the crowd begin to turn, curious, toward the door where nothing was happening. Then she thought of the piano. Not the grand in the room, but the old upright she'd sold. She thought of the last time she'd played it, the wood warm under her hands, a sound filling her tiny, hopeful apartment. That girl was still in there somewhere. She had to walk out for her. She pushed the door open and stepped into the light. The walk to the piano felt like a mile. The room was utterly silent, but it was a different silence than before. This wasn't respectful anticipation. This was confusion. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, scanning her, trying to place her. The 2 big black blazer, her simple black pants, her sensible work shoes. She was clearly not a guest, nor was she the glamorous performer they expected. A few people near the back whispered. Someone near the front raised an eyebrow, looking past her as if expecting the real musician to follow. She kept her eyes fixed on the piano bench. It was her only destination. Her face felt hot, but her hands, strangely, were ice cold. As she got closer, she saw the maestro still standing nearby, a glass of water in his hand. He watched her approach with a look of pure, unguarded astonishment. It wasn't mean. It was just complete disbelief. He knew the world of concert pianists, and she did not belong to it. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, not to her, but to the bizarre situation. That small gesture did something to her. It melted the last of her frozen fear into something else. A quiet, focused determination. She didn't need his world. She just needed to play dot. She reached the piano. Up close, the Steinway was even more magnificent and more intimidating. She could see the broken string inside, a single, coiled piece of metal rebellion amidst the perfect, taut rows of its brothers. She did not look at the crowd. She lowered herself onto the bench. It was still warm from the maestro. The feel of the smooth, polished wood under her, the solid presence of the instrument surrounding her. It was familiar. This was a language her body understood. She arranged the simple black dress of the waitress uniform under her. She took a slow, deep breath, not for show, but because her lungs demanded it. This was the moment. What would she play? Her mind, which had been a roaring static, suddenly became very clear and very quiet. She had told Mrs. Delaney she would play something they knew, but not as they knew it. Her hands lifted and settled over the keys. They were beautiful keys, cool and perfect. She didn't launch into anything. She let her fingers rest there for a second, connecting, remembering what it felt like to speak this way. Then she began, not with thunder, but with a whisper. A single simple melody emerged, clean and pure as water. It was Somewhere Over the Rainbow, but not the big brass version everyone knew. She played it slowly, sadly, turning the hopeful song into a lullaby of longing. Her left hand provided the barest touch of harmony, soft chords that seemed to hang in the air like dust in a sunbeam. The room, which had been tense with confusion, began to still. The whispering stopped. This wasn't what anyone expected. It was too quiet, too intimate, but it was so honest. She wasn't performing for them. She was just playing the way she played alone in the dark, thinking of what was lost and what might still be. She poured every bit of the last few years into those simple notes. The worry, the exhaustion, the quiet grief for a life put on hold, it all flowed out through her fingertips, transformed into something beautiful instead of sad. She saw her mother's tired smile from a hospital bed in the gentle rise of the melody. She felt the weight of the debt in the deep, resonant bass notes she softly pressed. Without pausing, she let the last, lingering note of the rainbow fade away. Then she changed. Her shoulders straightened just a bit. Her hands, which had been coaxing out a dream, now found a different rhythm. She slipped into the opening notes of Gershwin's I Got Rhythm. But this was no simple tune. She started slow and bluesy, teasing the melody, playing with it. Then, bit by bit, she began to build. Her right hand started to dance, adding playful twists and turns, notes tumbling over each other in joyful, complicated patterns. Her left hand woke up, laying down a walking bass line that swung with a life of its own. She was no longer just playing a song. She was rebuilding the room's energy from the ground up. The quiet sadness was swept away by a wave of sheer, ingenious joy. Her fingers flew across the keys, not with angry force, but with a dazzling, precise lightness. It was complicated, it was smart, and it was utterly infectious. A man at a front table began to tap his finger on the white tablecloth, a smile breaking out on his face. A woman near the back whispered, "Oh my goodness," not in disappointment, but in wonder. Helena forgot the crowd, forgot Carl, forgot Mrs. Delaney and the maestro. She was having a conversation with the great golden beast of a piano, and it was answering her back with the most glorious sound she had ever made. For the first time in years, she was not hiding. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. And the music was the truth telling everyone in the room exactly who she was. The last note of I Got Rhythm wasn't really a single note. It was a final, playful run up the keyboard, a bright, chiming chord, and then a deep, satisfying boom from the bass that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. Elena's hands lifted, floating for a second in the air above the keys, as the sound echoed and faded into perfect silence. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then the room exploded. It wasn't just applause. It was a physical wave of sound clapping, cheering, a few sharp whistles from the back. People were on their feet, not just a few, but seemingly everyone, their chairs scraping loudly against the floor. The stunned confusion of 5 minutes ago had been completely vaporized, replaced by pure, joyful shock. Elena blinked, suddenly thrust back into her own body. The bright lights of the room, which she had completely tuned out, now felt hot and blinding. The sound of the applause was a roar in her ears. She turned slightly on the bench, looking out at the sea of standing, clapping people. Their faces were alight with smiles, with amazement. It was overwhelming. Her heart, which had been steady during the music, now began to hammer again. This time with a dazed kind of panic. She saw the maestro. He was still standing in the same spot, but his glass of water was forgotten in his hand. He wasn't just clapping. He was nodding, a slow, deep, professional nod of respect. His earlier look of disbelief was gone, replaced by an expression of genuine appreciation. He knew what he had just heard. Mrs. Delaney was beaming, her earlier tension gone, her face glowing with triumph and relief. She clapped with the forceful delight of someone who had just won a very risky bet. And then Elena saw Carl. He was at the back, by the service door, his headset dangling from one hand. His mouth was actually hanging open. He looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Then, as if waking up, his face broke into a huge, goofy grin. And he started clapping harder than anyone, shaking his head back and forth in continued disbelief. A man in a distinguished-looking tuxedo, with kind eyes and a head of gray hair, began making his way through the crowd toward the piano. Elena recognized him from the program she'd seen earlier. He was the conductor of the city symphony. Her breath hitched. He reached her and extended his hand. She wiped her sweaty palm quickly on her pants and took it. His grip was firm and warm. "My dear," he said, his voice carrying even over the applause, which was finally beginning to slow. That was not just filling in. That was a masterclass in communication. "Where have you been hiding?" I work here," she said, the words sounding absurd even to her. He laughed, a rich, warm sound. "Not anymore, you don't. Not like that. That Gershwin." The voicings in the left hand. "Who was your teacher?" The question was so normal, so deeply rooted in the world she thought she'd left behind, that it almost made her cry. She named her old professor from Juilliard. The conductor's eyebrows shot up. "Ah, a fierce one. A brilliant one. It shows." He leaned in a little closer. "We are doing a pop series next month. Gershwin and Bernstein. I want you to come and play that. I mean it. I will have my assistant find you." Elena could only nod, her mind completely blank. This was not part of the script. The script was, "Play, don't get fired. Go home." Mrs. Delaney arrived then, placing a hand on Elena's shoulder. "You saved the evening, my dear. You saved it entirely." She turned to the conductor. "Wasn't she extraordinary?" "More than extraordinary," the conductor said. "That is a musician." The crowd was finally sitting back down, but the energized buzz in the room was completely different from the polite hum of before. People were leaning across tables, talking animatedly, gesturing toward the piano. They weren't talking about the broken string anymore. They were talking about her. Carl edged his way over, looking sheepish and amazed. "Elena, I don't even know what to say. That was okay?" She finished for him, a tiny, wobbly smile finally touching her lips. "Okay?" He repeated, then laughed. "Yeah, it was okay. It was a lot better than okay." He looked at Mrs. Delaney. Is she back on service?" Mrs. Delaney gave him a look that could have frozen the champagne. "Absolutely not. Elena is our guest of honor for the remainder of the evening." She turned back to Elena. "You will sit. You will eat. You will enjoy. And you will talk to people. They will want to meet you." The next hour was a blur. Elena was guided to a small, empty table near the front that was swiftly set with a clean cloth, a glass of sparkling water, and then a beautiful plate of food she hadn't served. People came by. A woman with emerald earrings told her the Chopin-esque version of "Over the Rainbow" made her think of her childhood. A man who owned several local restaurants slipped her his card and said, "Sunday brunch. Live jazz. Name your price." She smiled, nodded, thanked them, her mind still floating somewhere near the ceiling. She picked at the food, but mostly she just watched. She watched the other servers, her coworkers, moving through the room. They looked at her differently now. There was a new distance, but also a kind of pride. The busboy gave her another thumbs up as he passed with a tub of dirty dishes. It was like she had crossed an invisible line. The event wound down. Coffee was served, final donations were pledged to the symphony, a record amount. Mrs. Delaney would later whisper to her, and guests began to drift toward the doors. As they left, many stopped by her table again to offer a final word of congratulations. Finally, it was just the staff and the cleanup crew. The silence felt heavy and strange. Carl approached her, holding her old server's apron. It looked small and sad in his hands. "So," he said awkwardly, "I guess you won't be needing the early shift tomorrow." Panicked, the old familiar kind shot through her. "Carl, I still need the job. This doesn't change. The rent, the bills." He held up a hand. "Whoa, whoa. That's not what I meant. I'm not firing you." "Are you kidding?" After that, he shook his head. "I mean, you can't just be a waitress. Not here, not anymore, but how about this? We do a weekly Sunday serenade brunch. You play for 3 hours. We pay you triple what you make in a double shift. And you keep 1 lunch shift a week if you want to stay connected." But honestly, he smiled, a real, genuine smile. "You belong out front now, not back here." It was an offer. A real, tangible, better offer. It wasn't a fairy tale ending where all her problems vanished, but it was a door, swinging wide open. She could see the path, not a clear one, but one with light on it. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it for everything for not firing her when she stepped forward. For the chance, for this doc, she helped with the very last of the cleanup. More out of habit than anything. It felt important to not just walk away from the team. As she was stacking the last chair, the conductor found her again, this time with his very organized-looking assistant who had a tablet. "We are serious about next month," he said. "Give your details to Enya here. We'll be in touch tomorrow." Finally alone, Elena took off the borrowed black blazer and folded it neatly. She put her own apron back on for the walk out, not because she had to, but because it felt like a part of her, a reminder of where tonight started. She grabbed her worn bag from the staff locker and stepped out the service entrance into the cool night air. The city sounds rushed in: cars, distant sirens, the hum of life. It was noisy and real. She stood there for a long moment, leaning against the brick wall, feeling the solidness of it. She thought of the piano, now silent and dark inside. She thought of the feel of the keys, not as a memory, but as a recent, thrilling fact. She thought of the mountain of bills on her kitchen table at home. It was still there. But for the first time, she felt like she was standing on higher ground, looking at it, instead of buried underneath it. She wasn't a waitress who played piano. She was a pianist who had been waiting. And the waiting, at least for tonight, was over. She started the walk home, her steps lighter than they had been in years, the music from the grand piano still singing softly in her bones. The silence in her apartment was different that night. Before, it had been a heavy, empty thing, filled only by the muffled sounds of the city through the thin walls and the low, constant anxiety in her own head. Now the silence hummed. It was the quiet after a storm, a peaceful, ringing stillness that held the echo of the music inside it. Elena dropped her bag by the door and didn't even turn on the main light. She walked to the small, bare space in the living room where her upright piano used to be. The ghost of it was still there, in the lighter color of the floorboards. She sat down on the floor, right where the bench used to be, and rested her back against the wall. She could still feel the Steinway's keys. The perfect, cool smoothness of them. The solid, responsive weight under her fingers. She looked at her own hands in the dim streetlight coming through the window. They were just her hands. A little red from washing dishes. A small cut on one thumb from a broken glass last week. They didn't look like the hands that had made a room full of wealthy strangers leap to their feet. She thought about Carl's offer. Triple the pay for playing music. It was more money than she'd ever made consistently. It wouldn't erase the debt, not quickly, but it would change the math from desperate to manageable. It would mean breathing room. Real food instead of noodles. Maybe even saving a little. And the conductor. His business card was in her bag. A crisp, heavy rectangle of paper that felt like a ticket to another life. Was that real? Would his assistant really call? A part of her, the part that had gotten used to things going wrong, whispered that it was just politeness, that she'd never hear from them again. She was so tired. A deep, aching tiredness that came from years of tension finally releasing. She fell asleep right there on the floor, still in her clothes, the echo of Gershwin playing in her dreams. The phone rang at 10 the next morning. It was a number she didn't know. Her heart did a funny little jump. It was the symphony's assistant, Anya. Her voice was friendly and professional. "Elena, we spoke last night. The conductor asked me to set up a meeting with you at your earliest convenience. Would this afternoon work? We can come to you." They came to her, in her tiny, shabby apartment. The conductor, in a simple sweater now, and Anya with her tablet. They drank tea from her mismatched mugs and talked about music as if it were the most normal thing in the world. The offer was real. A guest soloist spot in the Pops concert. A modest fee, but a real one with a contract. It wasn't a fairy godmother moment. It was work. But it was the work she was born to do. "There will be rehearsals with the orchestra," the conductor said. "It will be demanding. But after what I heard, I have no doubts." When they left, the apartment felt bigger. The future, for the first time, had shape. It had a calendar with dates on it. Rehearsal, concert, Sunday brunch at the Loring Room. The next Sunday, she arrived for the first Sunday serenade. She didn't go through the service entrance. Carl met her at the front door. "This way, Miss Martin," he said with a playful formality, leading her through the empty, sunlit dining room to the grand piano. A small, elegant placard stood on it. Sunday Serenade with Elena. She wasn't in a uniform. She wore a simple black dress she'd owned for years. As the brunch crowd filed in, well-dressed families, older couples, friends catching up, she felt a new kind of nerves. This wasn't a one-time, adrenaline-fueled rescue. This was a job. They were here to eat eggs, Benedict, then listen to her. She started softly, similar to how she'd begun that first night, with gentle, familiar melodies. People listened while they ordered, smiled while they ate. A little girl in a frilly dress wandered over and stood by the piano, watching her hands with wide eyes. Elena smiled at her and played a bit of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" with jazzy chords. The girl giggled and clapped dot. It felt good. It felt real. She was background music again, but this time by choice, and this time everyone knew she was their dot in the weeks that followed. A new rhythm settled into her life. Mornings were for practice, digging out old sheet music, working on the orchestral pieces for the symphony gig. Afternoons were for her one remaining lunch shift at the Loring Room. It was strange at first, putting the apron back on, carrying plates. Some of the other servers treated her a little differently, with a kind of wary respect. But the work was the same, and there was a comfort in the familiar routine. One afternoon, as she was refilling water glasses, an older couple stopped her. The woman touched her arm gently. "We were here that night," she said, her voice soft. "For the gala. We tell everyone about it. You gave us a story we'll never forget." The man nodded. "You reminded this old heart what beauty sounds like," he said. Elena just thanked them, her throat tight. That was the thing she hadn't expected. It wasn't just about her. The music had touched them too. It had become part of their story. The symphony concert arrived. Backstage, surrounded by professional musicians warming up, the old fear tried to creep back in. Who did she think she was? An imposter in a borrowed black gown. But when she walked onto the stage, the applause was warm. She saw the conductor give her a confident nod. She saw the first violinist, a serious-looking woman, offer a small, encouraging smile. She sat at the piano, a different grand this time, and looked out at the sea of faces. This was the dream, exactly as she'd pictured it years ago. But it didn't feel like a dream anymore. It felt like a job she was ready to do. She played Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue with the orchestra soaring around her. And it wasn't perfect. There was a moment in the cadenza where her finger slipped, but it was alive and powerful and true. The applause at the end was thunderous, but it felt earned, not like a shock. Afterward, in the green room, the conductor handed her a sealed envelope. From an admirer, he said. Inside was a note on beautiful stationery from Mrs. Delaney. For the next chapter, it read, and tucked behind the note was a check. A generous check made out to her, with the memo line reading, Artistic Grant. Elena stared at it. It wasn't a life-changing fortune, but it was exactly the amount needed to pay off the final, stubborn chunk of her mother's medical debt. The last piece of the anchor. She sat down heavily, the note in her hand, and cried quiet tears of sheer, overwhelming relief. A year later, not much had changed, and everything had changed. She still lived in the same apartment, but it was no longer a place of fear. The silence was just silence, friendly and quiet. She played Sunday brunches at the Laurent Room, but now it was a packed weekly event people reserved weeks for. She did occasional gigs with the symphony and played at private events recommended by Mrs. Delaney's Endless. Networked one evening. She was setting up for a small, upscale wedding reception at the Laurent Room. She was the hired help again, but now her name was on the contract. As she tested the piano's tune, a young woman in a staff uniform approached hesitantly. She was new, maybe a student. "Excuse me," the girl said, her voice shy. "You're Elena, right? The pianist?" "I am," Elena said. "I heard about you. How you used to work here. As a server. Like me." The girl twisted her hands. "I play a little cello. Not like you, but it's just nice to see, you know, that it can happen." Elena looked at her, seeing her own old longing, her own fear, reflected in the girl's eyes. She smiled. "It can happen," she said. "Just keep playing. Even if it's just for you." She thought for a second. "The Thursday lunch shift is slow. If you want, bring your cello sometime. We can make some noise in the empty dining room after." The girl's face lit up, just for a second, with pure, undiluted hope. "Really?" "Really," Elena said. The guests began to arrive, and Elena started to play, something soft and romantic for the wedding party. She played, and she watched the room, and she felt the beautiful, solid truth of it all. She was neither just a waitress nor just a pianist. She was both. She was the girl who carried the trays and the woman who commanded the stage. The music had always been there, inside her, waiting for its moment to be heard. And now, every time she played, whether for a crowd of hundreds or for a single, hopeful busboy after closing time, she made sure it sang.